and you're probably wondering, does human rights law matter at all? Did I sign up for this class for nothing? And it's perfectly fine if that's what you think. A lot of human rights advocates still pose the same question to themselves and debate about this all the time. But there's a reason I assigned an article by Harold Koh, who's a famous Yale law professor who have written about human rights law a lot. And that's because he talks about this issue in a way that you perhaps haven't thought about before, and sort of a new way to understand how legal enforcement works. So the way he talks about is the parking law. And so human rights law doesn't work necessarily that differently from domestic law, which is the one that you think of as, oh, it's enforced really well all the time. Well, how many of you have broken parking laws? And I would say, just statistically speaking, not relating to your moral, sense at all, probably a lot of you did if you're living in an urban area and has a car. And if you don't, probably you know someone who violated parking law. But does that mean the parking law is useless? That, we should not have parking law at all? And sort of what that means is that a lot of times, laws are not necessarily just enforced because there's police or because there's penalty, because a lot of times you probably violated parking law because you could probably get away with it, or you thought I might not get away with it, but the penalty is not that high. But even if that happens time to time, and vast majority of the laws are enforced, not necessarily because you're worried about penalty, but because something else is at work. And that's something that he talks about in this article. And he talked about it in 5 different ways. And this is not just him talking about it. This is a lot of legal scholars who have studied this issue, and they have summarized it in these 5 different frameworks. There are probably more. And the first one that probably you're most familiar with is power, meaning somebody who's more powerful than you told you to do so. In this case, it might be people who government, police or judges, etc. But there's also rational choice theory, which is also talked about a lot and slightly different, which is that it was in your self-interest. And that could have been that you didn't want to pay the fee, a penalty, but that could be you wanted things to be safer, you cared about your safety, if you're talking about parking law. And what Harold Koh talks about is that it's not that different for human rights law either. But also there are other reasons that you would do these things, because as we talked about it, we might break these laws, meaning the external enforcement is pretty loose, but it would be really hard for you to break parking law every single day, all the time. And there's a reason you tend to actually abide by it. And scholars who have studied this came up with these 3 different ways to explain it. And one is a liberal explanation, which is that it sort of fits your norms. So you have inherent pull towards that law, that idea, because perhaps it fits with your ideology or your moral sense. And by that, for instance, if you were to talk about parking law, it might be the idea that we live in a community, there are pedestrians, there are other people with cars. So it's nice for us to all sort of put things in order and sort of have rules to make sure that things go by with each other. And that seems to fit my sense of morality. And that happens at the international level as well. And so people have shown, for instance, why did EU happen? And they have all these different laws that the governments abide by. And that is not necessarily just driven by power or self-interest. And the 4th explanation that he talks about, which is communitarian explanation, is a very fancy of saying peer pressure. And studies have shown that, for instance, if there are people around you, you're less likely to litter, you're more likely to abide by law. And that's not necessarily because those people have more power over you or they have direct influence on your personal interests. It's just that we do care about what other people think of us. And countries actually have shown to act in the same way. They actually do care about what other countries think of them, even the rogue ones. And so that's another explanation. And then the 5th explanation, legal process explanation, is that yes, we think about human rights as something that involves government. We have talked about that in the first class. But at the same time, government does not act in vacuum. There are a lot of other stakeholders who influence their sort of activities, and so we cannot just think of it as government to government relationship. So it could be citizens who protest and petition, it could be multinational corporations, or it could be non-governmental organizations like Human Rights Watch writing a report naming and shaming human rights violations, or it could be international governmental organization like United Nations with hundreds and thousands of employees who actually have huge influence on how the governments would comply with the law. So what all this means is that we are not necessarily just abiding by law because of external sanction. And in fact, as Harold Koh said in the article, the most effective form of law enforcement is not external sanction, but internalization of the norm, meaning you basically abide by law because it feels like it's the right thing to do. And government also, believes it or not, a lot of times act in the same way. And your role as a human rights advocate, as well as public health practitioner, is to persuade government that it is the right thing to do and internal